All right, guys, we got some operations of complex numbers now. So when you are asked to multiply some polar stuff, something that looks like r cis theta times a different r cis theta, how are you supposed to do that? So you take your two r's, which remember that stands for radius, that's these two, and multiply them together, and then take your cis, and these two thetas you're supposed to add together, okay? So multiply the r's and then add the thetas. That's a formula for how to do the product of polar stuff. And then similarly, we have a quotient. So whenever it's division, you take your two r's and you divide them, and then your thetas, you subtract them. And so divide r's, subtract thetas. And that is how we're going to do those. Close my parentheses there. Let's practice a couple of them. And so very first thing, this is a multiply one. So it's a quotient, or it's a product one. So what I'm going to do is take my two r's, which are this number and this number, 7 times 3, and I'm going to multiply them. And then remember, I'm supposed to add my thetas together. So 7 pi over 12 plus pi over 12. So when I simplify that, I'm going to get 21 cis. This is 8 pi over 12. And that fraction reduces. 21 cis 2 pi over 3. I can divide both those numbers by 4. So this is my final answer after using my product rule. Let's try another one. Again, what I'm going to do is take my two r's, I'm going to multiply them together. So 1/2 times 6, that's going to give me 3. And I'm going to add my two thetas together. So pi over 3 plus 5 pi over 6. I need to change this into a common denominator. So I'm going to change this into a 6 and make that a 2. So that's going to give me 7 pi over 6. And that is my final answer for that one. Okay, so I'm leaving my answers like that in cis form because it asked me to leave it in polar form. And so remember that cis is polar language. And so these next ones, this is going to ask me to do the division formula, but it's going to ask me to convert it to rectangular standard form. So that's a little bit different, so I'll show you how to do those. This is a division one, so again what I'm going to do is take my 10 and divide it by 6. And yeah, that's a fraction that reduces, so I'll do that in a second. But I need to subtract my theta, so 5 pi over 3 minus pi over 6. And again, I can make a common denominator here so that I can subtract them easily. So 10 divided by 6 gives me 5/3. And then when I do 10 pi over 6 minus pi over 6, that's 9 pi over 6, which actually reduces to... let's see, divide everything by 3, so I get 3 over 2. Okay, and so this is how I would leave my answer if it said leave it in polar form, but this one's asking me to convert it to rectangular form. So what that means is to turn it back into rectangular form, that means expand it and then simplify. Okay, so remember expanding uses the abbreviation for cis. So keep your 5/3 in front. That's going to be distributed at the very end of everything. But C stands for cosine of 3 pi over 2 plus I sine 3 pi over 2. So remember that's what cis stands for. The C stands for cosine, the I goes in front of the I or the sine, and the S stands for sine. Make sure you've got an addition sign here because that's what cis stands for, is it uses an addition. And then I'm pretty sure using the unit circle I can simplify cosine 3 pi over 2 and also sine 3 pi over 2. So I'm keeping my 5/3 in front. Cosine 3 pi over 2, the x value at 3 pi over 2 is 0. And the y value at 3 pi over 2 is -1. I need to distribute my 5/3 to that. And so after I do that, 5/3 times 0 is 0, but I get a -5/3 I. And that, my friends, is my final answer. And that is in rectangular form. Okay, let's do the next one. It's another division one. So again, I'm going to take 9/8 divided by 3 over 2 means flip and multiply by 2 over 3. So I'm just dividing, because when you divide by a fraction, that means flip and multiply by the reciprocal. Okay, and then I have cis, and I need to subtract my theta. So -5 pi over 6 minus pi over 3. Again, I can change this into a common denominator. I'm I'm going to reduce some stuff over here. 9 times 2 is 18, 8 times 3 is 24. And 18 over 24 reduces to 3/4. Divide everything by 6. And I'm going to have a negative theta. That's going to be negative 7 pi over 6. And if I wanted to, I could add 2 pi to that to figure out what the positive theta is. I think better in terms of positive thetas rather than negative thetas. So if you add 2 pi to this, you end up with 3/4 cis 5 pi over 6. Again, only reason why I decided to add 2 pi to this was because 7 pi over 6 is a negative theta, and I wanted to work with the positive theta. This is the same exact location on the unit circle, negative 7 pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6, but I think better in terms of positive theta, so I'm going to work with that. This is how I would leave my answer if the direction said to leave it in polar form, but it said leave it in rectangular form, so that means I need to expand it. I'm pulling my 3/4 out. I'm going to multiply that in at the end. I'm going to do cosine 5 pi over 6 plus I sine 5 pi over 6. And just remember that 5 pi over 6 is a 30-degree reference angle. And so our x value there is negative radical 3 over 2. And our y value there is 1/2. All I have to do is distribute my 3/4 into that. And I'm going to get negative 3 radical 3 over 8 plus 3 over 8i. And there's my final answer for that one. So again, remember when you multiply fractions, you do top times top and bottom times bottom. That's how I got 3 radical 3 over 8 here. And then 3 times 1 is 3, 4 times 2 is 8, and don't forget to leave your I there, okay? Let's go down to, let's see, number 3. Here's another division one. And so again, what I'm going to do is take my r's, my 4/3 divided by 1/2. That's the same thing as doing 4/3 times 2 over 1 because you flip and multiply. I'll simplify that in a second. And again, I need to subtract my thetas. So I'm going to need to get a common denominator, and I'm going to add a negative here. It's going to give me a negative again. So 4 times 2 is 8 over 3. When I simplify this, I end up with negative 9 pi over 6, which is the same thing as negative 3 pi over 2. Okay, and again, that's another negative theta, so I would rather deal with a positive theta just because it's easier for me to think about the unit circle in positive thetas rather than negative thetas. And reminder again, if the direction said to leave this in polar form, this would be my answer. But since it says turn it into rectangular, I need to expand this and then simplify. So cis stands for cosine plus I sine, and the theta is pi over 2. So again, the x value at pi over 2 is 0. The y value at pi over 2 is 1. And so distributing my 8/3 here, I just end up with 8/3 I. And that's my answer for that one. I'm going to skip number 4 for right now. The last one I'm going to tackle on this video is number 5. I just want you to keep in mind that it is very common to think that you can just square everything in here, and that would be incorrect. Then we would have like a pi squared situation. That's just not the right way to think about this. Just remember that what we need to do here actually is FOIL. So 4 cis pi over 3 times 4 cis pi over 3. And not FOIL because we don't have an addition sign here. I shouldn't have used the word FOIL, I guess. But the way that I want you to look at this is having two different parentheses that are exactly the same. That's what squaring it actually means. Multiply it by itself. So here we can apply our multiplication formula. We can take our 4 and multiply by our 4, which gives us 16. And what am I supposed to do with the thetas again in the formula? When you multiply polar stuff, you're supposed to add the thetas. So remember, when you add pi over 3 and pi over 3, the denominator stays the same, but you add the pi's on top, so we get 2 pi. And so now what I have to do is, again, it doesn't tell me to leave it in polar form, which this would be my answer if it said polar form. I need to expand it and simplify to get it into rectangular form. So cosine 2 pi over 3 plus I sine 2 pi over 3. And 2 pi over 3 is a 60-degree reference angle in the second quadrant. So remember that the x value there is -1/2. And the y value there is radical 3 over 2. Now all I have to do is distribute my 16 into it. So I get -8 plus 8 radical 3 I. And that's what my final answer looks like for that, okay? That is all for today, you guys. I'm going to save that number 4 to do in class because that's a calculator one. I want to be able to answer your questions. But we have now done some converting and used 2 new formulas, product and quotient formulas. So good job. Have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.